Summer is here, and so are harmful algal blooms. The Erie, Pennsylvania region is no stranger to harmful algal blooms and the advisories that accompany them. The cyanobacteria that is in these blooms has been studied for decades. So why haven't we solved this problem yet? Here to help us learn why harmful algal blooms are difficult to address and what policies are likely to be the most impactful in addressing them, we'll turn to Sarah Bennett, Penn Future's campaign manager for clean water advocacy in the Lake Erie watershed. Hello and welcome to a special digital program, a joint effort between the Jefferson Educational Society and Penn Future. I'm Ben Spagan, I'm the vice president at the Jefferson and am a contributing editor at the Erie Reader. Before we get to her presentation, a bit about the presenter. Ms. Sarah Bennett, as you heard already, is Penn Future's campaign manager for clean water advocacy in the Lake Erie watershed. She earned her bachelor's degree and master's degree in zoology at Michigan State University. After earning her degrees, she spent 13 years teaching biology at the college level. She served as the chairperson of the biology department and co-director of the environmental science program at Mercyhurst University for 2 years, and was also their sustainability officer for 2 years. She's a member of the Northwest Pennsylvania chapter of Sigma Chi, and the university was the university representative on Keep Erie County Beautiful Advisory Committee. She's organized many litter and dump site cleanups in the area and does so much more. Folks, I'd encourage you to head over to our website for a fuller bio, jeserie.org. And of course, folks, as you're tuning in, programmatic note, if you have questions, comments, this program is first airing live on the JES Facebook page. Leave those questions, comments in the comments section as we'll work our way through as many questions from you, the viewers, as we can as we host this event. If you have a question, just leave it in the comments section below. Of course, if you're watching or listening to a later broadcast, still send us those questions, those comments to keep this conversation going. And of course, for more information about upcoming JES programs and publications, visit that website, jeserie.org. And be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And of course, for more information about Penn Future, visit pennfuture.org, and also be sure to follow them on the social platforms too. Now, to get us started, to look at those harmful algal blooms here in the middle of summer, to unpack the science and the policy and what we can do in a path forward, I'd like to welcome Ms. Sarah Bennett back to the JES Digital stage. Sarah, thank you for joining us for this discussion.
Thank you for having me again. I'm happy to be here. Let me just share my screen here. All right, so I'm back with the Jefferson, very happy to be here. Today I'll be talking to you about harmful algal blooms and other types of algal blooms as well, and how we can close the gap between the science. As Ben mentioned, we have been studying these for decades, how to close the gap between science and policy. So I'll talk a little bit about the science today, just to get everyone up to speed. I know that the Jefferson has had previous content about harmful algal blooms, but just in case you haven't seen that, so we'll talk about what we do know, and I'll talk about policy, but then we'll talk about how to close that gap. I do want to bring up that this is part of a series of presentations that I've been giving with the Jefferson to raise awareness of the information that we published in Our Water, Our Future, a common agenda for protecting Pennsylvania's Lake Erie watershed. This is a document that Penn Future published with 12 regional organizations. We had a strong technical advisory committee with 4 additional organizations and 6 local scientists. At this point, so the document was published in December of 2020, and at this point has been distributed to all municipal government officials in the Lake Erie watershed. The document identifies threats to water quality and recommends solutions. Now, the main solutions, the main goal is policy solutions, because it's those solutions that are going to cause the broad changes that we need and are going to provide the resources and long-term change that is needed to address many threats to water quality in our region. I also want to mention that the #1 direct threat to water quality that we identified in this document was surface runoff from agriculture and stormwater. And this is related to harmful algal blooms, as you'll see today. Also, before we dive in and talk about harmful algal blooms, I want to talk briefly about how Lake Erie really has the perfect storm that provides an environment for harmful algal blooms to be successful or to occur. So Lake Erie, and on the right here is a map of Lake Erie, and it shows several subwater, all these shaded areas show subwatersheds that drain into Lake Erie. And it is the smallest lake by volume, so it has the least volume of water. It also supports the greatest density of greatest population density of any Great Lake. That includes 12.5 million people. It is the shallowest and warmest of the Great Lakes, and we'll talk about how that relates to harmful algal blooms. And it also supports the most number of farms of any other Great Lake. So all of these, and this will become clear as we continue to talk about harmful algal blooms, all of these create this perfect storm that is a great breeding ground for these algal blooms. I just wanted to also point out that when we talk about harmful algal blooms in the Erie region, we're mostly talking about cyanobacteria. We say algae because they are photosynthetic like algae, but they're actually bacteria, and specifically photosynthetic bacteria. So the image on the left is a cyanobacterial bloom. The photo was taken by my colleague, Mike Campbell, who is a biology professor at Mercyhurst University and has studied these blooms extensively. This is specifically in Presque Isle Bay. But I also want to point out that there are other types of algal blooms. In the middle, we see a red algal bloom that's caused by a different type of algae. And this is found in marine ecosystems. And then on the right is an algal bloom of green algae, true algae. And I point this out because this is much more of a nuisance bloom, and I'll bring that up a little bit later too. But just so you have some images of these lovely blooms, and these are different organisms, photosynthetic organisms that live in our water. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to do, and if you've been following content from the Jefferson, this will probably be mostly review for you, but just for those of you who don't, wanted to review this and just talk about the recipe for having an algal bloom. So first we have the cyanobacteria or algae that are already living in the water. So they exist already. And then what happens to cause a bloom is we have added nutrients. Now, there won't be a test today, but you see on the right, there is a term here, it's called eutrophication. And what this means is we are adding excess nutrients to the water. So it's just a term in biology. We love our terms. If you were one of my students, then you would know this term. But anyway, that's what that word means. And it really just means we're adding nutrients. Now, just like us, plants, algae, and cyanobacteria and all organisms need nutrients to survive. In the case of photosynthetic organisms, those nutrients, the major nutrients that they need are phosphorus and nitrogen. And so those are the nutrients we're talking about here. We also need sunlight. Again, these are photosynthetic organisms. They're going to use sunlight and carbon dioxide to produce their own food. Algal blooms also love warm, calm waters. And then this fifth thing, large rain events are not required for an algal bloom, but they do lead to increased incidence of algal blooms. Okay, so this is our general recipe for producing an algal bloom. So I want to connect this back to what I had on the previous slide. All right, so I said Lake Erie has the smallest volume and it's shallow and warm water. So that means that when we add nutrients to this, to our water, it's going to be more concentrated in a smaller volume lake and in a shallower lake. And because it's warmer, the algal bloom, the cyanobacteria and algae are going to survive better. So those warmer conditions are going to support these blooms. Add to that the high density of people who are fertilizing their lawns and businesses that are fertilizing their lawns, and the high density of farms in the Lake Erie Basin. Now that's the excess nutrients that we're adding to our waterways. And so that's why I say Lake Erie is the perfect storm. Okay, so we have a general understanding of the biology of algal blooms. But I just wanted to be really clear about human impacts on these blooms. And if we know what our impacts are, then those are places where we can solve those problems. So human impacts on blooms are largely in our addition of nutrients to our waterways. So the number one impact, negative impact that we have on algal blooms are contributing fertilizer or adding fertilizer to our farms, and that fertilizer running off into streams and eventually into Lake Erie, carrying the fertilizer with it. So the rain falls and carries the fertilizer with it. So we add that fertilizer because it's full of nitrogen and phosphorus that our crops need to grow, but excess fertilizer that's not used gets into our waterways. And then the other source of nutrient pollution is stormwater runoff from our cities and towns. That is, the nutrients largely come from fertilizing our lawns and our gardens and businesses fertilizing their properties as well. Now, I point out sediment pollution here specifically because this is of recent interest to the city of Erie and to Mill Creek Township. Last Thursday, there was a City of Erie City Council study session on stormwater, their stormwater feasibility fee. And the big bad guy there was sediment pollution. And so what they said is that the city of Erie is contributing too much sediment into our waterways from our stormwater. And so I wanted to make the connection here between that sediment pollution and this nutrient pollution. So with that sediment come nitrogen and phosphorus as well. And so anything we do to address our sediment problem, which we have to do in order to be compliant with regulations, will also help us with our fertilizer, with our nutrient pollution issue. So those two in blue here are really the top sources of nutrient pollution. But I did want to just point out a few additional, because again, if we're looking at solving problems, we want to understand all of the sources so we can tackle this issue from several different angles. So sewer systems can also contribute to nutrient pollution. So it's gross to think about, but our waste has nitrogen in it. And so if human or animal waste gets into the waterways, that's going to contribute nitrogen. This is especially an issue if there are septic systems. So in more rural areas, septic systems that fail, they're going to contribute this nitrogen pollution to our waterways. Also livestock, the manure management, manure from livestock can contribute nutrients to waterways. And then the last thing I want to point out, because I think it's really interesting and not something we typically think about, is that there is nitrogen in our precipitation. And that specifically is from the acid rain that falls in our region and much of the Northeast of United States. So in the image on the bottom right here, on the left, it shows sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides coming from industry and a truck here. So burning fossil fuels puts these gases into the atmosphere. Once they get there, they're going to react with water and fall as acid rain. So nitric acid is one of the acids in that rain, and when it falls into our waterways, that's contributing nitrogen too. Now, a lot of other chemical reactions have to happen for that nitrogen to be available to the organisms, but it is still a contribution of nitrogen to our waterways. So from several different angles, climate change is going to also make this worse. So humans burning fossil fuels and other human activities are contributing to climate change. And so that's another human impact. But in the Erie region, climate change is going to result in more warm days. It's going to cause warmer water. And so warmer water, we've already said, promotes harmful algal blooms. But it's also going to result in more heavy rain events, which also are going to contribute to these harmful algal blooms, increased incidence. And so it is expected that algal blooms are going to increase over time due to climate change. Okay, so hopefully everybody is still with me. This is a lot of biology and science of algal blooms, but I did want to get a good understanding, get everybody with me on what we know about the science of harmful algal blooms. All right, so now let's talk about the impacts. Now we're talking about harmful algal blooms, but that's one potential impact of algal blooms in general. So I'm going to talk about a couple of other things that happen here too. So the first thing, and I showed you that picture with the frog when we started, is that algal blooms, especially of green algae, can be more nuisance algal blooms. And so, you know, you might see this at Presque Isle once in a while. There might be a big algal bloom, and that algae is going to wash up on shore. And so it's more of a nuisance. You know, you don't really want to swim in it or see it on the beach. So maybe doesn't cause direct harm. However, there is recent research to show that those types of algae may harbor bacteria like E. coli and can contribute to bacterial issues on beaches as well. So it is mostly a nuisance, but might have a connection to bacterial loads on beaches too. The second impact that we see from harmful algal blooms are dead zones. And this image you've seen a couple of times already on the right. So if we look at the far right portion of this image where it has the light green here and it says algae bloom, what happens with these to cause dead zones is that you get this massive bloom of algae, but eventually, like all other organisms, those algae die. As they die, they sink to the bottom of the lake where there already is lower oxygen because most of the oxygen that gets into the lake comes from the atmosphere. And so it's largely on the surface of the lake. So there's already lower oxygen in the bottom of the lake. When these algae die, they are decomposed by microorganisms. And those microorganisms are going to use oxygen. So if you see this oxygen arrow going into the decay, they use oxygen to decompose these algae because there's so much algae that is being decomposed that uses up what's left of the little oxygen that's already there and results in dead zones. And so there is a very large dead zone that exists in the middle of Lake Erie, deep in the lake. The problem with that is that the living things deep in the lake need that oxygen to survive. So some organisms like fish can move away from that area and go find a place that has oxygen. But a lot of organisms can't move or can't move very quickly. And so they're going to die in that place. So whether those organisms have left or they've died, you're left with this massive zone in the lake that is dead for all intents and purposes. And that has far-reaching impacts on the lake ecosystem. And then the third impact are these harmful algal blooms. So what I mean by harmful algal blooms are blooms of cyanobacteria that produce toxins, and those toxins can cause illness in people or skin irritation. They can cause death in our pets, especially dogs. They can cause livestock death if the water gets there, wildlife death, and then again, impacts to our drinking water. They can cause beach closures, and that then, especially in a place like Erie that relies so heavily on our water to bring tourists to the region, can have impacts on the economy too. Okay, so that is the science of algal blooms. So we've talked about the biology, we've talked about several different types. We've talked about conditions that contribute to blooms, including conditions that humans contribute to, the sources of nutrients, especially those human sources. And then we've talked briefly about the impacts that these can have on our daily lives. Okay, so that's the science. So now it's, what's the solution? Like Ben said, we know a lot about harmful algal blooms. There's always more to know, but we do know quite a bit. So the solution is obviously to reduce nutrient pollution. There we go, folks. You've heard it at the Jefferson. I have solved the problem of harmful algal blooms, and we just need to reduce nutrient pollution. Now, obviously, it's not that simple. We can't just stop using fertilizers on our fields. We can't just stop having stormwater. And so these solutions are complicated. All right, so what is it going to take? So now we're going to move into talking about policy. What is it going to take to solve these problems? And really what we need, as I said in the beginning, are policy solutions that will cause these long-term changes and provide resources to address these issues. So this is going to require continued research so that we learn even more about these harmful algal blooms. We can predict when they're going to happen and where they're going to happen. That research requires funding. Eventually, we need to do some implementation, which is also going to require funding. We're going to need regulation that is going to, we have regulations, and I'll talk about that in just a little bit, but we're going to need stricter regulations because we have some in place and we still have this problem that is a growing problem. We need legislation, and we need all stakeholders to cooperate to really help with this. So I wanted to mention briefly that there are local programs that are working to address this. And so, for example, there is a local volunteer program that the Erie County Conservation District runs. It's called the Pennsylvania Vines Plus program. And VINE stands for Vested in Environmental Sustainability. This is a voluntary program for grape growers, and the plus is they're expanding to additional growers as well. And so what they do is they get growers in the region to voluntarily participate in this program. Those growers are educated about best management practices for how to reduce the nutrient pollution coming from their fields. And then they also get help with funding to implement those best management practices. This is a fantastic program, and we would love to see this grow. That does require funding to expand the program and to get more growers on board, but it is voluntary. As far as regulations go, there are existing regulations managing fertilizer in agricultural fields, managing stormwater runoff, manure management, septic and sewer systems. But like I said, so these exist, but we have a growing problem with nutrient pollution. And so existing regulations really are not doing the trick. Our state agencies and federal agencies recognize this. And so what stakeholders are facing is increased stringency, so more strict regulations, because we know we need to address this nutrient pollution problem and other pollution as well. All right, and that's really what the city of Erie is facing too. That was discussed very clearly at the study session last week, that there's this increased strictness to these regulations, and we need to figure out how to handle that. Okay, and then I do want to talk about the role that legislation plays here too. I'm going to focus mostly, I'll mention a federal program, but I'm going to focus mostly on Pennsylvania state level legislation. So legislation can increase funding. Penn Future and other water organizations across the state have for several years been advocating for increased funding to our natural resource agencies. That's the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, and Department of Agriculture, because those natural resource agencies are largely tasked with caring for and protecting and restoring our natural resources. Coming up this fall, there is, if you follow the state legislature, you're going to see talk of the Growing Greener reauthorization. So there's been a Growing Greener fund program to fund things like stormwater programs, septic and small flow treatment systems. I know specifically in Erie County, we've used these funds extensively for the septic and small flow treatment systems for repairs and replacement. So the money is gone from that program. And so, you know, we have this big influx of federal funding. And so what we're hoping to see is that some of that federal funding is used to reauthorize and kind of give new life to the Growing Greener program. We're also looking for a clean water fund that can provide funding directly for implementation of stormwater programs and other clean water programs. At the federal level, there is a really successful program called the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. This has had bipartisan support and was actually just increased. So the federal legislature increased the amount of money going to the Great Lakes because it's very well known what the impact of the Great Lakes are to the entire country and to Canada. Other pieces of legislation that are currently going, just as examples of what could be done, pieces of legislation that are currently going, moving through the state legislature include the Agriculture Conservation Assistance Program. This program will, if passed, will increase funding and resources to conservation districts to continue to aid farmers in implementing best management practices. I'll talk about what those, give an example of that in just a minute. Another legislation that's moving is fertilizer legislation. So I talked about regulation, especially for fertilizer application on farms. This bill gets at regulating and providing kind of rules for fertilizer application in residential and commercial situations. So it's going to establish a professional certification. Again, if passed, will establish a professional certification. That means that if you're a golf course or a university or a company that applies fertilizer, you have to have someone there who has this certification and has been trained in best management practices. It also standardizes labeling. And so the ultimate goal is that it will reduce fertilizer application in residential and commercial situations. And then a third legislation that is currently active in the legislature is protecting riparian buffers. And so that's this image on the right here. This is actually a picture from Iowa. I couldn't find a good, open source picture that I could use from Pennsylvania. I'll look harder for next time. But what you see here is an agricultural field on the left and a field on the right. And in between, you see this stream meandering. But hopefully what you notice is that there are a lot of trees and shrubs and grasses on either side of that stream. That was done on purpose. And so, what those trees, shrubs, and grasses are a riparian buffer zone. And nature has these zones. If you go out and go into nature if you can find something undisturbed these days, anyway, they have these riparian buffer zones. And so what happens here is when it rains and you have runoff with fertilizer in it, instead of going directly into this stream, it moves through this buffer zone where the plants do a couple of things. They slow down the water, they slow down the runoff. And so it doesn't just flash flood into the stream and cause major stream bank erosion. So it slows down that stormwater. But then the plants also serve to filter that water. They like those nutrients too. And so it's going to filter that water and also filter the pesticides that could be in there too before the water gets into the stream. So what you end up with is slower moving and cleaner water that's getting into the stream as it leaves this agricultural land. That's just one example of a best management practice. It takes a lot of education. It takes a lot of money to plant these riparian zones. And so that's where resources are needed in order for this to happen. And then the last thing I want to say here, not the last thing I'm going to say today, but the last thing I'm going to say on this slide is that local ordinances play a big role in, especially in managing stormwater runoff. So for example, again, I'll bring up the study session last week. If the city decides to move forward with addressing stormwater issues, that's going to happen through local ordinance. Okay, so we've talked about science. Hopefully you're all still awake and with me, because science and policy are pretty heavy, dry subjects sometimes. So we've talked about the science of what we know. We've talked about policy and given a couple of policy examples, but I promised that I would talk about closing the gap. So we've been doing research for decades. We have legislatures and local policymakers too, and federal as well. So how do we close that gap? And so there's two things I'm going to talk about here. And one is education. So we need an educated public to understand their impact on stormwater, for example, but also an educated public to understand if there are these policies that are put in place, understand why they're there. Now, locally, we have a ton of really fantastic organizations that do a lot of public education. So I've listed just a few of them here, and I'm sure I've missed several, so that's where my and more. And I've included Jefferson because I know you've done a lot with harmful algal blooms here too. So lots of education is what's needed. Again, that requires funding. So funding needs to be provided for that to happen. But the other really important piece here that closes this gap is advocacy to policymakers at all levels. Those of us who are educated about these issues need to talk to policymakers to let them know that we care about these issues and that there are solutions out there. Let policymakers know how harmful algal blooms impact you, or that you're concerned that they're going to continue to increase over time. To that end, I'm actually going to give everyone an actionable item here. Penn Future does have a program called Advocates for Conservation and the Environment. It's our ACE program. We call it our ACE program. And we are hoping to implement this in the Erie region. And so what we do here is we train residents, we train the average person how to talk to their policymakers about environmental issues, so that policymakers can hear from you. That's a really important aspect of being a resident of the United States, is talking to your policymakers, and it really is not done enough. And so this, by having a training, and even we can provide talking points for you. By doing that, you feel a little bit more comfortable. And once you do it a couple of times, you feel really comfortable with it. And that helps the policymakers understand these issues. Because, think about your policymakers, they're average people like you who happen to be elected to office. And they have to make decisions about that will have environmental impacts, as well as decisions that are going to have impacts on every aspect of your life. And no one knows all of that information. So we can help and we can play a role by educating our policymakers about these issues. So if you're interested in participating in that, my contact, you can just email me and let me know you're interested. My contact information is here. You can also go to the pennfuture.org website and learn more about that ACE program and things that Penn Future does. So with that, I am happy to take questions. And like I said, I hope you're all still with us here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
So Sarah, thank you for all of that, and blending in a way that makes it accessible, the science and the policy, and especially coming back to that at the end of closing the gap. And I'm just going to read one comment real quickly here from the Facebook post. That says, "We are awake," a big smiley face, exclamation points, good stuff, more exclamation points, and a smiley face. So the audience is still with us. People are loving this. People are chiming in other resources that have addressed harmful algal blooms. For instance, DEP's semi-annual LEAF, Lake Erie Environmental Forums, also addressed it. So the education's out there. I think it's connecting people to the education and then connecting them to policymakers. Like you said, that's part of the process. Here we're looking at it in our neck of the woods in Erie County, Pennsylvania. When we cross over on I-90, we see that big sign, "Welcome to Ohio." If we're headed west, we see a big sign to the east. If it's I-90 or 86, "Welcome to New York." Not really signs on the water here. And water doesn't necessarily know the boundaries the same way states might. So from that perspective, folks are wondering, and I wondered this too, what sort of interstate cooperation, also international cooperation with our partner to the north, Canada, that we share this body of water with. What do these conversations look like on the macro level when we're talking about multiple states being involved and then also two countries being involved in this?
Yeah, so there are a number of intergovernmental commissions that work on Great Lakes issues. So the Great Lakes Commission is one of them. It includes the eight Great Lakes states and 2 provinces. And so what they do is they recommend policies and practices, and they say to balance the use, development, and conservation. So I think that's one thing that we need to keep in mind is that, if harmful algal blooms are my issue, and obviously I am an environmental advocate, environment is my issue, but that has to be included in, weighed with use and development. I mean, honestly, the best thing for water would be for us to all go away. That's not going to happen. So that kind of gets at the complexity of these issues. And so what these folks do is they get together and they share information, they share what's worked, they share what problems they're facing, and then they develop these policy recommendations and practices. And they will communicate those with legislators at the federal level, both in Canada and in the United States. There's also the International Joint Commission. That is the 2 federal governments. And what they do is they approve projects that affect water levels and flows, but they do kind of move into issues that might impact water quality as well. And then there's also a Great Lakes Executive Committee and that runs the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. And that's the US EPA and Environment and Climate Change Canada. And so this includes representatives from both federal governments, the states, the provinces, indigenous nations, as well as municipalities. And so there are a lot of tables where people are coming together to discuss these issues. And there are policy recommendations that come out. But again, those policy recommendations have to be advocated for, and elected officials have to know that these issues, what these issues are, how they're impacting their constituents, and why it's important to address them.
One more comment I'm going to read here. Excellent presentation. And I appreciate that. Appreciate you diving into answering the question of the interstate cooperation, collaboration, and international work being done by groups as well. I think thinking in that line, an audience question here is asking about New York, acknowledging that this viewer points out New York had a HAB initiative. They started in 2018 that covers 12 lakes to address the issues. Does PA have such a specific program targeted to address the causes of each lake's blooms? So, do we have something like that? Are we learning from New York? Is that applicable? Because it's not just happening in our neck of the woods. We're seeing these statewide. So it's not just an Erie County problem. It's not just a Lake Erie problem. But of course, we're focused on that here. But statewide, what does it look like from Pennsylvania's vantage point?
As far as I know, there isn't I could be wrong here, but as far as I know, there is not a statewide harmful algal bloom initiative. There are initiatives for specific kind of major watersheds. For example, a big chunk of Pennsylvania in the center is part of the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and they have major initiatives that are going on to reduce nutrients. Individual lakes might have one. I think Edinburgh Lake, for example, has an organization that works on harmful algal blooms there. But as far as a statewide kind of collaborative initiative, I'm not aware of it, other than, like there are forums where people get together and talk about it. But as far as a big plan, I'm not aware of one.
And I think in thinking about, models to look for, I can't help but think in your presentation, I don't think anybody ever wants to be called the perfect storm, but it looks like Lake Erie is the perfect storm with its depth, the density around it, the farming around it, the rising temperature in the water that makes this a very welcoming environment for algal blooms. Are there other perfect storms throughout the country or globally even that we're looking at and saying, these communities are getting it right when it comes to addressing it and acknowledging the science and figuring out the right policy? Are there other perfect storms out there that we could look to say, if we're battening down the hatches, this is how to do it?
As far as other using perfect storms, I don't know any specifics, but I do know of some efforts that are doing things well. So I want to draw attention to Ohio. In 2019, they started a program called H2 Ohio. And this was looking at this program. It still exists. This program looks at water issues broadly, but that includes nutrients and harmful algal blooms. And the focus of this is it's all about partnerships and collaboration. And so it's kind of too soon to see how successful they've been, but they have a beautiful website that shows all of the things that they've done, and it looks really good. Hopefully, over the long term, it will result in some real success there. Maryland is also doing some really great things, passing legislation and developing partnerships to address these issues in their portion of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. At a conference I attended earlier this year, I saw that there were 6 municipalities in Maryland that got together and they applied for funding and hired a circuit rider that worked with all of those municipalities to come up with common solutions that they could all implement. And so by working together, that was a much more efficient use of resources, and they were able to implement some best management practices in their municipalities.
And it's good to see the power of regionalism when folks can work together toward a common initiative that is present in their region. Another comment, Sarah, I'm impressed with the breadth of your knowledge. Thanks so much for sharing. And I want to follow up with another question that says, specifically taking a look at back to the riparian zones, which I loved learning about today. First time I've heard that. I think they're beautiful. One of our other commenters said they really enjoy that as well. The question here is looking at French Creek and Elk Creek in Erie County, saying that those two creeks frequently run brown because of heavy rainfall, which is a result of climate change. Will improving the riparian zones improve this situation?
Yes, absolutely. Anything we can do to slow, so though that running brown is erosion. So what's happening there is you get massive influx of water and it erodes that stream bank and carries sediment. That's sedimentation, carries that sediment, which creates a really poor environment for living organisms in streams and carries that sediment out into the lake too. So if anything we can do to slow down that stormwater, riparian zones, green stormwater infrastructure, plants do this. Trees especially do this. Can slow that down and reduce that sedimentation and reduce stream bank erosion. So yes, riparian zones and other types of natural, I love the use, I have to say, I love the use of plants. And basically we're learning from nature. We're using the concepts of nature to do what nature can do better when we're not around, right? So slow down the water and trees do it. Yeah, so let's keep the trees.
This is the most natural filter, a filter by nature to do this. And I know you said no pop quizzes, but if you were to give us one, riparian zones need to be on then as we're taking that test after learning all of this. I too would be remiss if I didn't mention, because a couple of times it was present in today's, this particular discussion, mentioning stormwater issues. And prior, you had addressed that in a program that's still available on jeserie.org, where folks can plug into that conversation and learn more about stormwater runoff and the dangers associated with it, what we need to do to begin addressing that. Sarah, you went through a couple of different things of what the barriers are, and just to go back to those of, you know, barriers to fixing this problem, because it's clearly not going to go away on its own. We can't do nothing. If we do nothing, it'll continue to increase, and we're going to continue to see, troubled waters ahead of, we can't take our pets there. We don't want to take our children there. We may not want to take ourselves there as it continues to worsen. So science perspective, we need to cut off the nutrient source. We learned that today. And from a policy perspective, we need to do funding. But for those looking to do something today, the average person saying, yes, I know I need to put, now talk to my policymakers, and I've now learned the science, but what might they do on a smaller level, an individual level, something that they could do, being more mindful of their contribution to potentially, the harmful algal blooms? What can they do on an individual level?
I think so the biggest thing that the average person can do is have an understanding that everything that goes down those storm drains on your streets goes directly into a local stream or the lake. Both. If it goes into the stream, it gets into the lake. And that has dramatic negative impacts on water quality in the lake. Now, it's going to directly impact living organisms in those streams and in the lake. But it's also eventually, we get our drinking water. Most of Erie County gets its drinking water from the lake. And if we continue to pollute the lake, that makes water treatment even more expensive. So that is eventually going to even kind of impact our pocketbooks. So understanding that everything that goes down those drains goes directly into our streams and negatively impacts the water quality. I think the other thing that we need to understand is that stormwater and runoff, stormwater is part of the infrastructure that we need to live. So, and infrastructure has to be upgraded, and that costs money, and that money has to come from somewhere. And so the other thing that the average person can do is kind of understand that this is an example of something that needs to be funded. And there are lots of ways for that to happen. And so I'd say get involved in local processes to see how that can be funded too.
And right at the heart of that, another question in the comment section talking about, everything that enters the streets is headed down that drain. How do we stop the junk from getting in? And that's their word. How do we stop the junk from going down our storm drains? Is there better infrastructure that we could be looking into? Obviously telling people don't throw things in the streets and don't litter, but what all can we do to curb that, to find a better way to filter that out ourselves? Because I don't think we can put a riparian zone in the storm drain to fix it for us and let nature take over. What do we do as people to stop the junk from getting in there?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. So first of all, we can avoid fertilizing our lawns or minimize that fertilizer. If you're going to use fertilizer on your lawns, make sure that you understand when is the best time and don't over fertilize your lawn. So that's kind of stopping it at the source. But the other thing that I think this is so cool, I've seen this in Pittsburgh, and I know it's in a few other cities, probably Cleveland and definitely Philadelphia is doing this too, is at some storm drains in cities, you'll see that it's not just a typical storm drain. You'll see that there are these plants around that storm drain. And so what that is, that's green stormwater infrastructure. And that's not just planting plants. Actually, we can do that too. You could plant a rain garden yourself or plant a pollinator garden around the drain if you wanted to. But in cities, they can engineer this type of stormwater infrastructure to collect the rainwater and use these specific plants to filter that water and slow it down.
So I'm going to take my comment right back. I don't think you can put plants in the storm drain to fix this, but apparently we
Again,
can. So we can put
yes.
anywhere we can put plants. I think that's the thing I'm taking away. Anywhere we can put a plant, put a plant. And I want to read a comment. I'd be remiss if I didn't share it with one of our viewers acknowledging that Relief, the Lake Erie Arboretum's tree planting program, is planting trees in riparian zones this year and as long as necessary until streams are protected, both in those in the Lake Erie watershed and the French Creek Allegheny River watershed. So other initiatives out there, and I take that away. If you've got a problem, I'm not sure what problems can't be solved with plants at this point. Is what I'm hearing from the program. So I'm taking that away with me, Sarah. As we are almost out of time, and we covered a lot. And again, thank you for going through the science and the policy and working to close the gap between the two, and help everyday average citizens figure out ways to address this locally. I'm taking away plants are a great part, if not the greatest part of this solution. But if you wanted people to take something away other than that, or maybe that is it, but if people are carrying something with them out of this program into the night and remembering it tomorrow morning and thinking about this, when we think of harmful algal blooms and closing that gap between science and public policy, what do you hope they take away?
Yeah, so first of all, I think I hope that they are empowered to go and talk to their legislators. I think that's a really important missing piece in a lot of different issues that we experience. But I also want viewers to recognize that all of our actions impact the environment and that we do depend on that environment to provide us with clean water, the air that we breathe, and the materials that we use. And so we can live sustainably, that doesn't deteriorate that environment that we need, but it takes understanding, it takes effort, and it takes collaboration for us to do that. So we really can't live every person to themselves. We have to come together to solve these major problems, and really kind of embody this concept of a society, and that we're all part of that.
And comments still coming in. Wonderful presentation. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So, Ms. Sarah Bennett, Penn Future Campaign Manager for Clean Water. Thank you, thank you, thank you for sharing your knowledge, your insight, and taking the time, energy, and effort to be here in conversation around harmful algal blooms, the science, the public policy, closing that gap. Thank you.
You're welcome. Happy to be here.
And Sarah, before we go, for folks looking to access the document you mentioned earlier, because this is wonderful to always be here, joint programming here with Penn Futures and JES. You mentioned Our Water, Our Future, a common agenda for protecting Pennsylvania's Lake Erie watershed. For folks looking to find that and to learn more about Penn Future, please remind them where to head to on the web.
Sure, they can go to www.pennfuture.org. That's PENN future.org. Or you can email me at bennett@pennfuture.org, and I'm happy to provide it.
Fantastic. And folks, you tuning in, whether you're watching in real time live, this program airing, or catching a later broadcast, streaming it on demand, thank you, thank you, thank you for watching. These conversations and the exchange of ideas and information would not be possible without you. Friendly reminder to stream other JES digital programming on demand, including that Penn Future JES series. Head over to our website, jeserie.org. There you're also going to find details about upcoming programs, as well as a wide range of publications from quick timely reads to reports, essays, and more, all available free to download. And of course, be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Ben Spagan. Be safe, be sound, and thanks for listening and learning with us.